have a very light duty today, and that is to introduce a man who needs no introduction. I was trying to think of what to say earlier, and I looked at the Auburn seal, and as you know, emblazoned on there are the words research, instruction, and extension. And today's speaker exemplifies all those things and has for years. He is truly one of Auburn's shining lights, and we're all fortunate to be able to bask in his reflected glory. Wayne Flynt.
Thank you, Dwayne. I'm going to be uncharacteristically tied to the podium because they're recording this. So those of you who are familiar with the fact that I hate being behind this and tend to walk toward you until you really feel uncomfortable with me because you're afraid I'm going to fall in your lap, today you can really relax because I'm going to stay right here. I'd like to thank Dwayne Cox and the library for lots of reasons. One, this is where I've lived so many years of my life here in Auburn, working on various books. And two, because it is now the home of the Encyclopedia of Alabama. They've made space available. They've been wonderful. And on behalf of the entire staff, I'd like to publicly thank them for their support for the encyclopedia. It's kind of bad to raise $1.5 million and not be sure you know you're going to have an office, and we finally have one, and it's really great. I want to do this presentation today in three parts. And I want to start off with a fairly obvious premise, which is historians really ought to do more than just tell you the story of what happened. They ought to tell you the story of the context that determined what happened and helped explain why it happened. And so I'm not going to tell you this story beginning with February and March of 1872 when the really important decision that most of you came to hear about was made. Rather, I'd like to go back in time and tell you about the historical context that made that such an important event in Alabama's history, not just Auburn's history, but Alabama's history. And I want to begin with a couple of assumptions that most of you will know about already. One, the story of Alabama is a story of race. Behind every decision, behind every interaction, behind every relationship, there seems to be a racial story. And so the first thing you need to remember as I'm speaking today is that in 1872, the population of Alabama was just slightly more than half and half. It was slightly more white than black, but just barely. So in terms of the ratio, something between 52% white and about 48% black. The second thing you need to understand is that historically in this state, almost all decisions had been predicated upon the regional sectionalism of a state that is a very big state compared to most states in the eastern seaboard. And if I can demonstrate this with a map, from north, the Tennessee Valley, to Mobile is about 350 miles, about 150 miles from Russell County across to Mississippi. And geographically, quite diverse because you have a mountain range in North Alabama, which has a watershed that empties into the Tennessee River. And that river is unusual in the United States in that it flows east to west. It makes a loop like a horseshoe out of Tennessee, then across Alabama, east to west, and then goes back into Tennessee. And the reason that is tremendously important is because this area of Alabama is actually more related to Tennessee than it is to Montgomery. And in fact, even to this day, if you know the area well, you know that typically many more of their students will tend to go to the University of Tennessee and Vanderbilt than will typically come to Auburn or the University of Alabama. You will probably also know from the secession era that if you were a cotton farmer in the Tennessee Valley, and an awful lot of Alabama cotton farmers were located in that rich alluvial plain, you know that the difficulty with deciding about secession or union was determined largely by the fact that Tennessee hadn't decided in December 1860, January 1861, which way the state would go. Tennessee, like Virginia, waited till the very end to secede, almost to the point of armed confrontation between North and South. And as a consequence of that, if you happen to be a cotton farmer in the Tennessee Valley, you knew that if Alabama seceded and Tennessee didn't, you had sold your last bale of cotton during the Civil War. because there would be no way to get it to market. Also, this had been a home of Jacksonian democracy, little d democracy, and very much in contrast to the more patrician and aristocratic traditions of the planting culture of the Black Belt area of Alabama. The second session of the territorial legislature, which met in St. Stephen's, the territorial capital of Alabama, in 1818, is a perfect reflection of this sectional division in the state. The decision had to be made with Alabama about to enter the Union about where the capital was going to be located and what the nature of the Constitutional Convention of 1819 would be. The southern part of the state, which was rapidly losing population to the north with the influx of people down the Tennessee River from Tennessee and the Carolinas into this rich cotton-raising area, population shifted from Mobile and the Tombigbee Valley up to the Tennessee, and as a result of that, the southern counties were more than a little concerned about the future. So what they wanted to happen in the Constitutional Convention of 1819 is for every county to be represented. However, the counties up in the northern part of the state, Madison being the most important and at that time the largest county in the state of Alabama, wanted the basis for the 1819 Constitutional Convention to be population and not the individual county. A compromise was worked out in that second session of the 1818 legislature in which it was decided that the population would be the representation for the 1819 Constitution, but that the capital of Alabama would be located in the southern part of the state, not the northern part. Huntsville compromised on having Huntsville as the temporary capital from 1819 until such time as a building could be built to house the seat of government in Cahaba. And so the capital of the state is down here in Dallas County at the juncture of the Alabama and of the Warrior and, the Cahaba River and the Tombigbee River, and the center of population here, the center of government here. By the 1840s, two things had happened. One, the state capital had moved because of floods in Cahaba to Tuscaloosa in the northern part of the state. And the second was that the shift in population had once again occurred, and now no longer is the Tennessee Valley the center of population, but Alabama in the Black Belt and the southern part of the state. As a result, in 1847-48, the decision is made to move the capital yet again. It's gone from Huntsville to Cahaba, from Cahaba to Tuscaloosa, from Tuscaloosa to Montgomery. And actually there were serious questions in the northern part of the state about whether the North was essentially losing its major role in the state. There was even one proposal to put the capital on wheels and just move it around wherever people wanted it to go. So late 1840s, 47, the capital goes to Montgomery, and from that time forward, it remained in the South. But of course, the population is going to shift again, although pretty much after 1900. The reason I say all this is because you can understand that the division of the state along north-south lines has become, along with race, the pivotal issue in the state's history. There had even been a tradition that one United States senator would be elected from the northern part of the state, one from the southern part of the state, so that both parts would have representation, and that would somewhat relieve the tension between the two sections. You might keep in mind that this tension is certainly still there by 1860-61, and in the debates over secession, no county above Calhoun County, this is right here, my home county, Calhoun, and no county above Calhoun voted for secession. Every county north of there voted against secession. Almost every county south of there voted for secession. So you can see how tense the situation was between north and south as late as the 1860s. That's point one. Point two is the growing cleavage between north and south, which has many expressions, mainly economic and political. But in addition to that, there were also religious divisions between north and south that split every major religious group in the 1850s. And then, perhaps most importantly for our discussion today, there were very important divisions along the lines of higher education. A great many fathers, it was after all a patriarchal society, a great many fathers in Alabama and other southern states had demanded that their sons come home from northern schools in the 1840s and 50s as the sectional debate became more and more tense and enroll in southern colleges and universities. The result was a great boon for higher education in the South, which had never been considered up to the qualitative standards of the North. And so it had been a long tradition that Southern young men would leave the region, go north, receive their education, then come back south. And that tended to disappear in the 1850s. As a consequence of that, you could argue that though Southern universities were not qualitatively up to the standards of Northern universities, quantitatively they were every bit up to the standards. For instance, the largest university in the United States on the eve of the Civil War was Yale University with 502 students and 21 faculty members. That year, the University of North Carolina had 450 students and 15 faculty members. The University of Virginia had about 415 students and 14 faculty members. And I made some notes about schools a little closer to us. For instance, Emory University had 126 students in 1860, the University of Mississippi 140 students. And in Alabama, where there were 17 colleges on the eve of the Civil War, the University of Alabama had 120 students. My alma mater, Howard College, now Samford University, had 150 students to represent the largest school in the state. Those 17 colleges in Alabama on the eve of the Civil War, though they varied greatly in academic quality, are all going to experience a common fate. With the exception of Spring Hill College, every male college in the state closed during the Civil War, and many of them remained closed well into the Reconstruction period. There were 2 women's colleges in the state that were able to stay open during the Civil War, but only Spring Hill, a Jesuit school in Mobile, among the male colleges, remained open. Worse than that, if you look ahead, the result of the Civil War was devastating. Though there was very little actual fighting in Alabama, the only campus to be terribly affected in that regard was the University of Alabama. John Croxton's raid resulted in burning much of the campus. Most of the other schools were like East Alabama Male College or Howard College. They were turned into Confederate hospitals and occupied usually by Union forces after the war or by freedmen. And so there was devastation of a different kind than the University of Alabama. By the end of the war, endowments had largely vanished from all the schools. Campus buildings were either damaged or destroyed. Laboratories, scientific equipment, libraries had virtually disappeared, been plundered, sometimes by Union troops, sometimes by others. Trustees, administrators, faculty, students, large numbers of them dead in Confederate service. So what you have by the end of the Civil War is pitiful remnants of once proud schools across Alabama. The impact of the upheaval can be seen southwide. For instance, in the 1860 census, there were 868,000 Southerners who had attended school. 10 years later, in 1870, the census listed 519,000, a decline of more than 300,000, partly reflecting the fact that 250,000 Confederate soldiers, many of them well-educated or at least literate who had attended school, are now dead, and part of it due to the fact that so many schools had simply closed, and if you came of age between 1860 and 1870, typically you didn't attend school of any kind in the South. By 1870, the story in the South was pretty much the same, although perhaps worse in Alabama than in some states. In this state, where there had been 17 colleges with more than 2,000 students in 1860, 10 years later, there were only 8 colleges, and there were half as many students as there had been 10 years earlier enrolled in college. So the essence of the South's educational problem, and certainly the crux of the problem in Alabama, was literally to recreate higher education. The war had retarded a system which was growing rapidly, both in quantity and quality, in the 10 years before the Civil War began. And because the South possessed very few well-developed public school systems, the loss of college alumni, students, faculty, financial support, and facilities was a critical blow that, in my opinion, helps to explain something of the dearth of visionary political and economic leadership in the state of Alabama after the Civil War. That's part 2. Now, what I was asked to do, the establishment of the state's land-grant colleges. The Morrill Act, passed July 2nd, 1862, has been called by one historian, and I completely agree with him, the most significant nationwide educational legislation ever enacted in the United States. For those of you who know something about the history of higher education in Europe, the classic tradition of the trivium and the quadrivium, the classical origins of the college, who attended college, you probably know that that was pretty much imported to the United States intact. And so the one thing the United States has contributed to higher education, and I think has made higher education in this country the best in the world, is the idea that education is something that belongs to the people. It just doesn't belong to an educated elite. And our great democratic tradition rests as much as anything else, not upon the founding fathers, but upon the land-grant universities. The idea of taking education to the people. That act, passed in 1862, provided that within 5 years, a state could apply for 30,000 acres of land or land script for each United States representative and United States senator in order to establish, and here I'm quoting, a college of agricultural and mechanical arts built upon the science, classics, and military tactics in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions of life. So the idea was to take agricultural and mechanical education built upon a core of the classics and the sciences and military arts to ordinary people in their several pursuits and professions. In 1866, there was a second Morrill Act, this one to extend the provisions of the 1862 Act to the 11 Confederate states, which, because they were not in the Union in 1862, were, I guess, from a legal standpoint, not able to get the benefits of the Morrill Act. Under terms of the Act, Alabama received a total of 240,000 acres. Alabama applied for the grant in February of 1867, but because of Reconstruction upheaval in the state, did not actually implement the Morrill Act in the state until February 1871. Now, when that implementation occurred in 1871, beginning with the legislative session in November of 1871 and extending through that legislative session until March of 1872, there were four major issues. Number one, the geographical sectionalism that I've already mentioned. The sections basically lined up, each one competing with the other to get the location of the land-grant university. The primary consideration was that the land-grant college be located in an area that was reasonably accessible to the largest population of the state, which pretty much ruled out the wiregrass, the hill country, pretty much guaranteed it was going to be somewhere in the central part of the state, somewhere in the Tennessee Valley, or somewhere in the Black Belt, because those were the major centers of population. Of course, who got that really was important, because for one thing, it would add tremendous prestige to the town and the region around the town, and for a second consideration, in the difficult economic days of Reconstruction, it would mean a tremendous economic boon to the merchants because of the expenditures by students, faculty, and others that the college would bring. The second consideration was the expansion of sectionalism into Alabama politics. The rivalry, as I've already indicated, between North and South Alabama played out in virtually every legislative matter in Alabama history, and the debate over where the land-grant college would be located was no exception. Third, there were major sectarian differences in the state. The early advantage in terms of religion had belonged to the Methodist. The famous circuit riders who had moved across this state from one part to another, from the Tennessee River all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, had resulted in the state being primarily Methodist in the frontier period. But by the Civil War, the Baptists had caught up with the Methodists and would soon pass them in the early years of Reconstruction. But during the debate that I'm going to tell you about today, like the racial debate between black and white, which was almost 50-50, the relationship of Methodist and Baptist was almost exactly the same. And they had been locked in such a bitter and long theological debate that the story as it unfolds is almost unparalleled in terms of what happens. That's to whet your appetite and get you all prepared for the surprise that's coming. And of course, then race was ever present in this decision to locate the college, as in everything else. Three towns became the chief contenders for this wonderful new plum: Tuscaloosa, Florence, and Auburn. Chief among the factors winnowing the decision to these three towns was a provision in the Morrill Act that limited federal funding to programs and personnel, but not buildings. In other words, the state had to provide the buildings, and then the Morrill Act would provide the rest. In a state as poor as Alabama during the early Reconstruction period, the question of how would the state fund buildings, and especially in a period when virtually every dollar was going into education or internal improvements, was a real problem. Thus, the university had the initial advantage. It had some buildings left that Croxton did not burn, and to use these buildings would save the state the expense of having to build a new campus. As a result of that, one supporter of the University of Alabama appealed to alumni of that institution to, quote, see that her interests are not forfeited for the want of a proper presentation of her case. And then he scolded other locations for being interested in the land-grant school primarily for their own economic advantage, or, as he put it, for sectarian religious advantage. I'm not sure exactly what he meant when he said that Alabama should not forfeit the land-grant college for lack of a proper presentation of her case, but I do know that during the debate in the legislature in the fall of 1871, the University of Alabama sent its entire cadet corps, which would be the entire student body, to Montgomery to march up and down the streets. Now, whether this was to gain the prize by force or just to impress the legislature with the parade qualities of the cadet corps, I'm not sure, but I do know that a lot of critics of Tuscaloosa immediately condemned the cadet parade as an improper example of lobbying. The other contender was Florence Wesleyan University, a Methodist college established in 1855 and which had struggled to survive the Civil War, as had the East Alabama Male College. In 1871, the North Alabama Methodist Conference, trying to save the college at Florence, offered the school, valued at $50,000, to the state to be used as the site for the Agricultural and Mechanical College. The local paper, the Lauderdale Times, countered critics who complained about the geographical remoteness of the site near the corner of Mississippi and Tennessee, and those of you who drive regularly to Sheffield and Florence will understand the problem of geographical isolation. You can get there. Well, I just won't go into that anymore. I love the area, but it's hard to get to. The Lauderdale Times issued what is undoubtedly the finest example of frank pork barrel politics in 19th century Alabama. This was the editorial. We demand a portion of the great state loaf which is being kneaded at Montgomery and which busy hands, sometimes, alas, unscrupulous and grasping, are breaking, dividing, and carrying away east, west, south, everywhere save to North Alabama, where surely a title to a part may justly be maintained. Now, if you want an exegesis of that passage of Scripture, it goes like this: you got yours, now we want ours. Auburn's bid, the third bid, was the most desperate. The East Alabama Male College, incorporated by Methodists the year after the Florence institution, Florence in 55, the East Alabama Male College in 56, had closed between 1862 and 1866 and reopened 3 years later, 1869, but the school had no president. I know that's a surprise to you, but the school had no president. It had 2 faculty members and virtually no students. And so desperate did the denomination become that the Methodists voted to give the entire campus to the state if the Mechanical and Agricultural College would locate here. In fact, so desperate were they that they also chose the extreme remedy of admitting women to the East Alabama College, and that is really a sign of desperation, at least for Alabama males in 1871. December 1871, the conference offered the school to the state of Alabama, and that began the great debate. Those partial to the Tuscaloosa site expressed concerns about one obvious coincidence in both the Florence and Auburn offers. Both were Methodist schools. And there were a number of editorials strange in this world of predominant religious politics, in which a number of newspapers warned against entangling the land-grant college with denominational ties and control of the school. Because the only serious rival to the University of Alabama, the only two were at Florence and Auburn, and both were Methodist, the intent of this admonition was pretty obvious. Bill Rogers, my major professor at Florida State University, who holds 2 degrees from Auburn, probably loves it more than anybody I've ever known, and sort of imprinted that on his student who had never been to Auburn at the time, and is the leading scholar on the question of why and how the school was located at Auburn, contends that if Baptists had entered this debate, it almost certainly would have resulted in the school being located at the University of Alabama. Baptists represented half the state's population, and they had been battling Methodist for 40 years for hegemony over the state. If they had said, we want it to be in a location where a Baptist college already exists, for instance, Marion, where Howard College was, it had been the largest college in the state in 1860. It was in the center of population in the state and could very well have made the offer. And if it had done so, Bill contends, almost certainly the University of Alabama would have gotten the college, because the legislature would not have wanted to have gotten involved in a debate between Methodist and Baptist over where the college was going to be located. And if I can engage in just a little bit of what-if history of my own, consider this scenario. In late January 1872, while the debate was going on in the state legislature over location, the flamboyant president of Ealaton Land Company in Birmingham, newly formed in 1872, James Powell, offered 15 acres of land to the state of Alabama for college buildings and a drill field, 30 more acres for an experimental farm and a building for agriculture, dormitories which would house 200 cadets, and a gift of $20,000 to the state if the land-grant college would go to Birmingham. 17 years later, Birmingham was a thriving industrial boom city of the New South. Howard College had relocated from Marion to Birmingham, the leading Baptist college in the state, now located in Birmingham. Suppose the debate had occurred not in 1871-72, but in 1889, with Birmingham the center of population, a major New South industrial city, the greatest wealth in the industrial part of the state, and with a Baptist college located right smack in the middle of the town. If that had happened, could my alma mater have become the site of the new land-grant college, in which case I could have taught all 40 years in the shadow of a certain trustee who shall remain nameless. Dear God, thank you for small favors. So now the battle shifts from journalists, civic boosters, churches, denominations, and Methodist colleges to the state legislature. Lee County had perhaps the best and most effective representative of all, Sheldon Toomer. Yes, that is right, T-O-O-M-E-R of Opelika, who introduced a bill to locate the land-grant school in Auburn. Others introduced bills favoring other sites, and deliberations beginning in November of 71, lasting until January and February of 72, kept the debate going. Suddenly the debate took a new direction in late February 1872, when a thought occurred to a number of legislators who had not had it previously. Would African Americans be permitted to attend the new college? Very interesting question. No discussion had taken place about establishing a second land-grant college for blacks, and so inevitably one could conclude the new land-grant college must therefore be biracial. You can imagine how that thought went over in the legislature. On February 12, 1872, Montgomery Representative Holland Thompson, I might add, a distinguished black Baptist minister and educator, enormously articulate, very influential in Baptist history in the black community in the state, also a member of the legislature, moved to provide for a biracial land-grant school. His motion was tabled, but the issue paralyzed the legislature. Race now took central stage to the questions of sectionalism and sectarianism. Thompson finally agreed to withdraw his proposal if the land-grant money was divided equally between white and black land-grant colleges. 2 days later, on the 24th of February, a bill placing the land-grant college at Auburn finally passed. But that same day, Governor Lindsay Democratic governor, endorsed a request for an additional Morrill grant based on the state's black population. The problem was in 1862, when the Morrill Act was originally passed, the basis for representation in Alabama was 2/5 of a person for blacks. A black counted for only 2/5 of a person. Thus, under the terms of the Morrill Act of 1862, the state would have gotten an insufficient amount of money to represent the full population as it existed in 1871. The bill calling for creation of 2 colleges, one for blacks and the other for whites, now stalled the bill which had been passed to locate the college at Auburn and reignited the entire debate. In fact, there was even a renewed attempt to move the college back to Tuscaloosa. Finally, on February 26, 1872, Governor Lindsay signed a bill designating Auburn as the site of Alabama's land-grant university. Tuscaloosa, I'm glad to report, took the defeat gracefully. They don't always do that. Florence did not. One Tennessee Valley newspaper predicted that no North Alabama students would ever attend the Agricultural and Mechanical College in Auburn because no parents would risk the health of children by sending them there. Not quite accurate. The legislature, ever wary of alienating sections of the state, gave a sop to Florence by voting in December of 1862 to locate a state normal college in Florence as a sort of sop to the loss of the agricultural college. That was the beginning, incidentally, of the University of North Alabama. On March 20th, 1872, the new board of directors selected the Reverend Isaac Taylor Titchener, a distinguished Baptist minister, Confederate hero of the Battle of Shiloh, self-taught geologist and mining engineer, as the first president of the new land-grant college, retained the Methodist East Alabama Mayo College faculty, all Methodist, but added 1 Presbyterian and 1 Episcopalian to the faculty. The new school that began on March 25th, 1872, was thus religiously diverse in a way, the way Alabama was at that time, and had 103 students in attendance for that first session. Baptists, though shut out of the faculty, were pleased to have one of their own as the new president. One Baptist leader wrote, "We verily thought, while about as numerous as all other denominations in this state, that there was a design in excluding us entirely from place in the organization of the new university." The fallout. Number one, Sheldon Toomer never lived to see the grand design of his scheme. He died in March of 1872 before the legislative session ended and before the new college began. 2, in terms of religion. One editor assured readers that religion had nothing to do with Titchener's selection as the first president of Auburn. Quote, "His religious character was a mere accidental circumstance, and it was simply and entirely the supposed peculiar fitness of the man that induced a majority of the board to cast their sufferance for him." Parenthetically, he had been a serious candidate for president of the University of Alabama and a distinguished person who later, in fact, largely due to his surveys of the Bibb County and Shelby County coal fields that led to the industrial development of that part of Alabama as one of the great coal areas of the South. All of that due to his work. So he was a distinguished person, whether or not he'd been Baptist. In terms of politics and race, the state's leading Republican newspaper, the Alabama State Journal, located in Montgomery, which had favored Auburn, incidentally, as a location for the new land-grant school, was not at all happy with the political process that had resulted in its creation. It criticized Governor Lindsay, a Democratic governor, for appointing only Democrats to the board of directors, the equivalent to the board of trustees, and by way of contrast, mentioned the fact that the previous Republican governor, Governor Smith, had appointed distinguished men of both Democratic and Republican parties as the board of directors of the University of Alabama to reorganize that school after the Civil War. The paper protested the one-sided kind of politicization in the selection of Auburn trustees as opposed to the University of Alabama, and also protested the failure to establish a second separate land-grant school for blacks in the state. Final fallout from this debate, chronic underfunding. Soon, the question of direction and sectarianism was a minor question for the new land-grant school. Actually, the major question was survival and whether Auburn could survive. Alabama became the only state in the United States funded by Morrill grant funds that did not supplement the act with local state appropriations. Thus, curiously enough, Auburn got its money from the federal government, but not one dime from the state of Alabama. So began the future of Auburn University and many of the state's higher education problems. Think about it. Regional debates over the fair treatment and the location of the universities. 2, debates over the role of religion in higher education. 3, trustee appointments that were basically political. 4, the racial fairness of fund distributions for black and white students in colleges. And 5th, chronic state underfunding of Auburn compared to the University of Alabama. It all sorts of reminds me of a sentence from one of my favorite Southern novelists, Lee Smith, in North Carolina, who in her novel Oral History wrote, "Nothing is ever over, nothing is ever ended, and worlds open up within the worlds we know." Thank you very much. Anything about Sheldon Toomer, Jack? You know more than I do.
I don't know anything about him.
The only thing I know about him is that, like most black belt legislators at the time, he was enormously influential. The black belt tended to have the best educated legislators in the state. The black belt had been the center of support for public schools. In fact, the 1854 Public School Act, Alabama, believe it or not, from 1819 when it became a state until 1854, did not have a public school system. It had schools, but it did not have a statewide system. And that support came mainly from the black belt, including Toomer. North Alabama and South Alabama tended to be very hostile to appropriations for schools. The black belt tended to be very supportive, and so this is the very area where you'd had most support for public education. Beyond that, I know nothing about him. Does anybody here know anything about him? Well, that is a great topic for development, and let me suggest that this whole territory that I've covered today is a wonderful subject for a dissertation or book. In fact, the first article that I published in a national journal, in the Journal of Civil War History in 1968, was on Southern higher education during and after the Civil War, from 1860 to 1875. And the editor, publisher of Civil War History asked me shortly thereafter if I were planning to write a book about Southern higher education, because he said it's such an important topic and nobody has done it. And to my knowledge, nobody has done it to this day. And it is such a tremendously important story because much of the South's lagging behind. In 1930, the South's per capita income was 1/2 the national average. And I think much of the reason for that is the fact that the South lost a whole generation of educational leadership and virtually all of its higher education infrastructure during the war and shortly after. David?
Wayne, what was the vote in the legislature to place the land-grant college at Auburn? Was it close? Was it?
It was not close. It was one-sided. And the reason for that was largely because the black belt pretty much was one-sidedly in favor of Auburn. And that was really important because at the time the black belt was so powerful in terms of Alabama politics. And also you've got to remember that Birmingham was not established until 1872. And so when you talk about North Alabama in 1871-72, what you're talking about is Huntsville and the Tennessee Valley. You're not talking about the so-called Birmingham district of industrial towns, including Gadsden, Anniston, Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, Jasper. And so it's really pretty one-sided.
Thank you.
Ed Zorn?
I was surprised to hear you say that the Morrill Act really was the seminal event for public higher education. I would have guessed it would have been the GI Bill after World War II, because that brought primarily rural men into the higher education process. And I know that from family history, from my wife's side and so on many folks of that generation.
You make a great point, Ed Zorn. The reason I would disagree with that is because the tremendous generation that entered the higher education system in the United States after 1945 is going to change its demography dramatically, but it doesn't change the structure of higher education. That is, what you learn and how you learn it is very much there. obviously, there are accruals. I think of, for instance, the development of colleges of business, which you just don't have in the early part of American higher education, either on the land-grant campuses or in the traditional universities. What you start off with is the classic trivium and quadrivium, and these are the great liberal arts colleges like Yale and Princeton and Davidson and Howard College, my alma mater. Then what you do is graft onto them the technical aspects that the land-grant college brought. And one reason that I loved Auburn so much in my 28 years here is that, to me, what this university represented was learning taken to the people and taken off the campus. And in Europe, education was very much place-specific. After the Land-Grant University Act in 1872, in America, the idea of education was that it can be anywhere, it can go anywhere. And you know, what a great universal concept. And to me, distance learning that you have now, say, at Troy State, you know, where it's like kudzu, they're all over the world. And, they deliver education everywhere in this world. And so, in a sense, distance education is just another offshoot from that great ideal of taking learning off the campus to ordinary people who do ordinary things. And I think it's just the most amazingly democratic assumption about education. Dwayne?
What relationship, if any, do you see between this urban rivalry over the location of the land-grant school and the subsequent history of the land-grant school and the New South Creed that was beginning to take its form around this time?
Great question. For one thing, I think the modern idea that Alabama is divided along urban-rural lines simply is not the major issue in 1871-72 because rural Alabama was just developing. Now, in the years between 1865 and 1885, there are 40 or 50 towns that develop upcountry from Mobile, and they become really important. The most notable example of this would be Birmingham. But that's just one of many industrial towns that are developing in the upcountry in the 2 decades after the war. But that's still to come. And so what plays out is not so much an urban-rural division as a north-south division. Later on, I think there would have been real questions about locating a major land-grant university in a very rural, small-town part of Alabama. I think that later on would have been a major problem. And in fact, I think probably later on, the school would not have been located in Auburn. It's a good thing this debate came in 1871-72 because I think if it had been 20 years later, this school would have gone to Birmingham, because the shift in the population is already becoming very intense. African Americans are leaving the land, and they're going to leave it with even greater rapidity after 1915. So it's a good thing this debate came when it did. But I see the issue pretty much non-urban, rural. David?
How many acres were the Methodists offering from their original college campus, or was there additional public land that was given to bring the core campus of 1,800 acres today up to that figure, or was the Morrill Act totally paid in land script?
No. The way the land script worked was the state got 30,000 acres, then you could sell that land, survey and sell that land. And incidentally, the land generally wasn't very good because the good land had already been claimed earlier, but there are still vast areas of land that were so bad in Alabama nobody wanted them. Now that's because they were not good farmland, but they had timber on them, they had mineral resources on them, so in fact they sometimes brought in quite a considerable amount of money. However, in the specific case of the Auburn offer was the core campus of East Alabama Male College, which was very small, enhanced by local Auburn people who had no relationship whatever to the college except incidental. They might be Methodist and live here, but they had no relationship to the college itself. And they gave an additional 100 acres. So there was the core campus and 100 acres that became the core to the original Auburn campus.
Professor Flynt, you mentioned that there was at one point some consideration for establishing a second land-grant college in Alabama for the African Americans. What happened subsequent to that, in relation to the formation of Tuskegee Institute and its growth as what would seem to be a land-grant university, at least in terms of programs. Could you fill us in a little bit on that, please?
One of the great roads not taken in Alabama was the fact that we could have avoided something in the neighborhood of $100 million in legal battles if we had made the decision in 1871-72 to create a second land-grant university supported by the state. The fact that we didn't do this, and thus when that institution was finally, actually two institutions were ultimately established. Tuskegee, which is quasi-private, quasi-public, but has land-grant functions, and then Alabama Normal College at Alabama A&M, as it's called now, Normal, Alabama, or Huntsville. And when that school was established and later became a land-grant university, those two actually have three land-grant universities. And they have a separate identity that is racial. Then when you try to eliminate that separate identity that is racial and bring them together, the old-timers in the room, especially in the College of Agriculture, know the rest of that story, which is literally hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees and the reallocation of funds. The case still in a federal court in North Georgia District. In fact, there's debate right now, the state of Alabama asking that case be dismissed. And that case now involving a really interesting question, which is the entire tax system of the state of Alabama. It was amended a year ago, and part of that case was dismissed by the federal judge, but part of it has to do with the entire tax system of the state of Alabama and whether the tax system, in essence, perpetually discriminates against African Americans by denying them an adequate education and underfunding black schools, especially in the Black Belt. So that, you know, all of the stuff that's been added on to that classic debate, which affected, as you know, the College of Agriculture at Auburn in particular, and led to the division of the state essentially along north-south lines, with North Alabama coming under the purview of the land-grant programs at Alabama A&M University, and then Auburn sharing Tuskegee with Tuskegee programs in South Alabama. All of that could have been resolved in two ways in 1871-72. One is to open the school as a black college, which of course would have been unthinkable given the racial attitudes of the time. But the second would have been to have created and then adequately funded on an equitable basis a black land-grant university. But then, I mean, if you're not going to fund African-American public schools on an equitable basis, which we didn't get around to until the 1950s when we began to see the dawn of Brown v. Board on the landscape. Only then did Alabama begin to fund public education at close to white levels. So it's inconceivable they would have done so 75 years earlier. Jim?
Hey, Wayne. This may sound like heresy, but given some of the conclusions to your talk, throughout the talk, you've made it sound like it was a good thing that turned out that the land-grant university was located here in Auburn. But I mean, to take your what if a little bit farther, why not conclude otherwise, that perhaps it would have been better for it to have gone someplace else, or for it to have developed 20 years later and have gone to Birmingham? I mean, how would the institution have been different, state support, and all these other things that you brought up? Was it an altogether good thing that it ended up in Auburn?
You know, Jim, I'm not sure the degree to which historians really ought to argue the goodness or badness of a decision like this. I can simply say it would have been very different. The history would have been very different. Actually, if I can again speculate about what might have been, I'm not sure it would make any difference now. That is, if you look at our 5 leading feeder high schools, our 5 leading feeder high schools are Grissom in Huntsville, Mountain Brook, Hoover, Homewood, and Vestavia Hills. All 5 of those schools are in North Alabama. So obviously the regional stuff's pretty much gone. Other than the fact that Harry Philpott once told me that Auburn was the largest Baptist school, university in the world, which in fact it is. There are more Baptist students who attend Auburn than attend Baylor University. So it is in fact the largest Baptist university in the world. But other than that, the sectarian issue is really no longer with us. The race question is not really any longer with well, the residue of that is in fact still with us here. But I'm not sure that if it had been located in Birmingham, it would make any difference now. I think it would have made a lot of difference in the intervening years between 1871 and perhaps the 1950s and 60s. I think it would have made a lot of difference in terms of who went, how it was endowed, how it was funded. Anthony Donaldson is going to talk a lot about the funding stuff. But just the question of what programs you have here. For instance, if you have a law school, an awful lot of your alums wind up in the legislature and as governor. And if you look at the number of Auburn grads who were governor of Alabama in the 20th century, 2. And if you look at the underfunding of this school compared to the University of Alabama in terms of comparable programs, it is unbelievable, the difference between the average funding base for a student at Auburn versus the University of Alabama. So the programs that never developed here, like a law school and a medical school, which might very well have come a lot earlier if this school had been in Birmingham, probably would have made an enormous amount of difference in the dynamics of the school and its relationship. I just remind you, there are an awful lot of land-grant universities that have distinguished law schools and distinguished medical schools. The University of Florida. Florida has not done badly in its battles with Florida State. Take it from an alum of Florida State. We were the underfunded school. The University of Georgia manages to have a law school and a medical school. So actually Auburn is the aberration in the pattern of land-grant universities, not the norm, but the aberration. And I think that might have been different if it had been in Birmingham rather than Auburn. Yeah.
What was the attitude during the early years over the question of focusing on liberal arts training versus agricultural and mechanical training?
George Petrie was, again, an aberration. Most of the presidents of these new land-grant universities came from a very different background, but Petrie was a classicist. I'm sorry, not Petrie, Tichenor. Tichenor was a classicist. Tichenor was trained as a minister, and a ministerial education consisted of Latin, Greek, and theology. He was self-taught as a mechanical engineer and a geologist. He had learned that by basically reading books. But he had spent the time after he resigned as pastor of First Baptist Church in Montgomery as an economic developer, mechanical engineer, geologist in Bibb County and the area south of Birmingham. The result of that is when he came here, he brought two threads of the land-grant tradition together. The classic core on which the land-grant university was built, and then a real commitment to what the land-grant university represented. And so when he came here, he was committed to keeping the traditions of East Alabama Male College. The Methodist, theology, trivium, quadrivium, classics, history, and all that, he was committed to. And if you read his papers and letters and journals in the archives, it's just amazing how committed he was to that. He was also committed to this new vision of the land-grant university as a democratic extension of rights. And incidentally, as a new book by an Auburn grad, I'm proud to say, a new biography of Tichenor that has just appeared this past year, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this in the fall when I speak in the series again. But as he points out in the book, Tichenor was so much committed to both these worlds that he was the perfect president to bridge the gap between the old classical college and the new land-grant university. And in his development of the curriculum here, that's precisely what he did. And then adding to that is that not long after Petrie left, George Petrie comes here. After Tichenor left, George Petrie comes here. Remember that Petrie's father was a Presbyterian minister at the Presbyterian Church in Auburn, then had gone to Charlottesville, Virginia, so he had grown up in the shadow of Mr. Jefferson's university. Petrie had gone to the University of Virginia, and when he came to Auburn to teach classics, basically Latin and classics, in the 1880s, he came as a classicist in the tradition of Tichenor. And then when he went off to Johns Hopkins and was going to get a PhD in classics and wound up getting a PhD instead in history, came back to Auburn. He brought that classics tradition with him, along with a deep commitment to the idea that in the North they had discovered the sound mind in the sound body that was the Greek ideal, and bringing that to Auburn meant professionalizing sports. And he had seen football as a result of the interest of his major professor at Johns Hopkins And he brought that back to Auburn. So that didn't come from inside Alabama and Southern culture. That came from Baltimore and Johns Hopkins. So you graft onto the land-grant university and the classical tradition, Petrie's tradition of football. Now here we're talking about a professor of Latin and Greek and the founder of the history department who brings football to Auburn. We have never forgiven him in the history department for that. But the truth of the matter is, that's what makes Auburn, Auburn, is the traditions that create this institution. And those traditions are basically the fusion of an athletic culture, the mechanical and engineering culture of the land-grant tradition, and the classical tradition of the Latin Greek scholar, which is, that's a tradition that gives you some great traditions, but that is also a tradition that gives you tremendous tension. Good, Zorn?
Now that you've explained the grand tradition of the land-grant college, explain to us why so many people on this campus are ashamed of the land-grant tradition. Is that a matter of being ahistoric?
I'm embarrassed to say, Edzard, that is the downside of the classical tradition. Some of you in the history department can testify to the fact that for 28 years, first 8 years as head of the department and then the rest of the time as an historian in the department, I lobbied the entire 28 years for an historian of agriculture, to no effect within my department whatsoever. And my argument was that in a land-grant university, what could be more appropriate than an historian who understands, loves, appreciates, and is dedicated to the idea of life on the land? I would argue that the problem in this university, the 28 years I was here, is not only, I would say that at first there were a lot of people in agriculture who rather resented the liberal arts. I would say that in my 28 years here, I met just as many people in the liberal arts who resented agriculture and put it down. And I think much of the trouble this university's had, historically and politically, is the inability to bridge that gap between these two separate worlds and to mutually respect each. I happen to be one who deeply respects my colleagues in forestry and agriculture and horticulture, and I know there are a lot of classics people here who do, but I would say there are a heck of a lot who don't. And I think that's a great tragedy. Yeah. Okay, last question.
Why do you think that those problems have been created? I'm an agriculture communications major, and I know even in dealing with people in the College of Agriculture and dealing with people in liberal arts, it's still that way today. What do you see as the future of getting rid of that problem and solving that?
Well, for one thing, we need each other pretty badly. Y'all got declining enrollments. And if you had a lot of support from liberal arts because we really think that what you do is important, I think it would emphasize the fact that whether you've got declining enrollments or not, you're important to this university and its historic mission and to an awful lot of rural people who live in this state. So I think in that sense, it's important that we affirm you. By the same token, you have a lot of commodity groups that give you disproportionate political power in the state, so that the Cattlemen's Association, the Forestry Association, and Alpha are in fact the 5,000-pound elephants on the street. You may have less than 1,000 students, but you got a lot more than 1,000 pounds of influence within this university. So we need each other. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I just think getting to know people in the other disciplines has been the most revealing part of my experience. I see Dean Jerstad here, and Dean's from forestry, and I got to know Dean playing handball and listening to the problems of forestry and getting something of the vision and the importance of this industry to the state of Alabama. And I guess I got my sensitivity to forestry by playing handball with him and hearing people in his field talk about their problems. I don't know. So we talk a lot at universities about sensitivity training. We usually mean race and gender. The sensitivity training at this university has more to do with race than gender. It has to do with people in agriculture and people in the rest of the campus. Thank you very much.